Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to go over the Quebec Act of 1774. This is the second of our experiments in government that we're going to be looking at. So yesterday I had you looking at the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and during this presentation I'm going to be referring back to that one a fair bit. So what was the purpose of the Quebec Act? When the British conquered Canada in 1760, they thought that lots more British people would come to this country, but that didn't happen. So when the war ended in 1763, so the conquering actually took place in 1759-1760, but the war itself didn't end until 1763. In 1763, all the British soldiers that were in Canada went home. And what that meant was that there was now only about 50 English-speaking people in the colony. And when you've only got 50 English-speaking people in the colony, it's pretty hard to talk 80,000 French-speaking people into changing their language and culture. So, at the same time, the 13 colonies, those are the American colonies, were really unhappy, and they were threatening to go to war with Britain. This is going to end up being the American Revolution. Now, Britain wanted to make the 80,000 French-speaking people in Quebec happy, because they didn't want them joining the Americans in the war. As it happens, in 1775, the Americans did go to Quebec and did ask them if they wanted to join, but because of the Quebec Act, the people of French-speaking Canada said no thank you. Now, if Britain did have to fight the Americans, and you've got to understand, they knew a war was coming. But if they were going to have to fight the Americans, they needed a land base where their army could be, because it's really hard to fight on the water, or if your only place is on ships. So Quebec was seen as a perfect place to do that. So it was really important for them that Quebec stayed in British hands. So the purpose of the Quebec Act was to do two things. Okay? So it reversed the Royal Proclamation, because the Royal Proclamation had made the French Canadians so mad, so that they would be happy, so that they would be loyal. So number one purpose was to make the French Canadians happy and loyal. But it also meant that they would have a land base to fight the coming war against the Americans. So how did they make the French Canadians happy? Well, first of all, the British gave land back. So remember when we talked about the Royal Proclamation, the British had taken a lot of land away. So the original New France had been this whole area down in here. And under the Royal Proclamation, it was reduced to just this red area. So now, under the Quebec Act, they were given all of this area back. So see how it doesn't come to the Great Lakes? So now they got all of this area around the Great Lakes. They got all of this area down here. And most especially, they got this area in here and this area in here. Okay, and that one, that's the Ohio Valley area, and that becomes super important in a little bit. So there was lots of arguments over the Ohio Valley. The Ohio River Valley was a very fertile place, but it was owned by the Aboriginal people. So when the Ohio Valley got returned to the Aboriginal people. So the Quebec Act gave the Ohio Valley back to the Aboriginal people. But what that meant is that that really frustrated the British colonists in the 13 colonies, so the Americans. Why was that so frustrating for them? Because they had already been selling that land illegally and sending settlers to the area. And they wanted to be able to keep doing that. They really thought that they should be given that land. Now, the settlers that were going into the Ohio Valley were sometimes attacked by the Aboriginal people who resented them being on their land, which I'm sure you can understand. If somebody set up a tent in the middle of your front yard and decided that they were going to live in your yard, you probably wouldn't be too happy about that. So the American colonists had wanted the British military to march into the area and enforce their claims. In other words, they wanted the British military to go into the Ohio Valley and to kick out the Aboriginal people, to fight them and to defend the illegal settlers who were there. But the British military refused to do this. So instead, the colonists sent their own militias. A militia is it's an army made up of regular people, not trained soldiers. So they sent these mostly untrained, not soldiers, to the area. And as a result, because they weren't very well trained, there was terrible bloodshed. And what I mean by that is that these American militiamen went into these areas, and because they didn't have training, and because they didn't have discipline, they didn't conduct themselves well, they didn't behave well, and they killed so many of the Aboriginal people. So the bloodshed and the massacres were not Americans who were dying, but rather they were the Aboriginal people who were dying. So now the Quebec Act comes in, and with the Quebec Act, the British government formally gave the land to the French Canadians and to the Aboriginal people. So the American colonists were furious. They felt they had been betrayed by their own leaders. So how did the government change under the under the Quebec Act? Well, when the Royal Proclamation had been in, the Catholic people were not allowed to hold office, to vote, or to do anything else that was important to the governing of the colony. And remember, all of the people in New France were French, and the official religion of France at the time was Roman Catholic. So all of the French Canadians were Roman Catholic. So none of them, no French-speaking person, would be able to hold office, to vote, or to do anything important in the government. But now that the Quebec Act was coming in, Roman Catholics were now allowed to do those things. But the British government was a little bit weird, and they made them promise not to act Catholic while they were doing their jobs. Now, I don't know quite what it means to act Catholic, but apparently they weren't supposed to do that. The British also gave power back to the governors. Now, the governor was given back the authority to grant lands to people, but it would be now under the British system, not the old seigneurial system. So in other words, instead of handing out land in rectangles, it would be in squares. Now, what did that mean? That meant that the seigneurial system, the one where you had a landowner that owned a lot of land and rented it out to people, well, that was going to end. Because now, why would you rent land if you could own it? The British also gave religious freedom. This is another way that they made the French Canadians happy and loyal. So the Catholic people in Quebec were guaranteed their right to practice their religion. and the Catholic Church was given back the right to charge tithes. So now they could afford to have French language schools. So what is a tithe? A tithe is like a tax that the church gets to charge. Usually it's about 10% of your income. So whereas before the Catholic people did not have to pay this, now they did. But now that the church was getting the money, they could now put French language schools in. So some people liked it, some people didn't. So how did the French Canadian people react to the Quebec Act? Well, that depended on who you were. If you were rich and powerful, you were very happy because you would have been given back all your power and all your wealth. So who were the rich and powerful? They were the priests and they were the seigneurs. So the rich people were the priests and the seigneurs. And they were so happy with the British that when Britain asked the French Canadians to fight with them against the Americans, the rich people supported the British. However, they didn't support them to the extent of sending their own sons. They just supported them in that they told everybody else that they should go. Regular people, not quite so happy. They liked that they were getting French schools, but they didn't like the idea that they had to pay the tithes again. And so when the American Revolution began, a lot of the habitants, that's the regular people, they rejected the clergy, or like the priests and the seigneurs' appeals to join with the British against the rebels. Instead, they saw this as a British war and it had nothing to do with them, so they didn't join up. What about the American colonists? How did they react? Well, they were furious. They hated that they still did not get the Ohio Valley, and they felt that Britain was trying to stop them from expanding west. They wanted to control the entire continent from one side of the ocean to the other. So, is the Quebec Act still important today? Well, yes, actually it is, especially to the French Canadians in Quebec and to the Indigenous people of Canada. If you're an Indigenous person in Canada, especially if you are living in northern Quebec, the Quebec Act gives you a certain amount of control over the land. So it is actually still law today. For the Quebecois, that is the French-speaking people in Quebec, the Act gives them guarantees of language and cultural rights, and that's something that is so important to the people of Quebec, even today. So, the Quebec Act is still important. So, your job today was to fill in all of the missing words on your notes page. Tomorrow, I will provide you the reading and a set of questions so that you can complete those for the following day. Until then, take care. See you tomorrow.